6-foot table talk as we find out who walks the walk. It's the bane of our existence to practice social distance. 6-foot table talk.
Hello and welcome to 6-Foot Table Talk, a series bringing civil discourse and understanding back to the table. My name is Nigel Eastman and I am honored to be your host, but this series is not about me. This series is about the conversation. So let the talk begin.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sarah Fox.
And I'm Mike Buntyn.
And it looks like tonight we're going to come and talk to you a little bit about our civil liberties. We're going to come and talk to you tonight about our civil liberties, how they relate to our faith journey and our right to vote, our decision to vote, and the importance of that in our faith journey and as Christians, whether that's a responsibility, a right, and how we should approach that as people with faith. The right to vote is mentioned 5 times in the Constitution, but yet we don't actually have a constitutional right to vote. Therefore, because of that, African Americans, women, felons, lots of disenfranchised groups throughout history have not had the right to vote. Mike, can you kind of walk us through a little bit some of the history and how we have come and evolved as a nation and become more inclusive in who gets to vote in our elections?
Sure. So originally, the right to vote was given to white men over the age of 21 that were property owners. And in the first 50 years of the Republic, you started to see a phasing back of that through Jeffersonian and Jacksonian democracy to where all white men over the age of 21 were able to vote. And then we had the 15th Amendment where all men of color or all men were allowed to vote, followed up by the 19th Amendment in 1920, giving the women the right to vote, and then the expansion of the right to vote under the 26th Amendment to 18-year-olds in 1970. And so it's been a long and ongoing process. There's been some groups that have not been considered citizens, and later on, like Native Americans, were given citizenship in 1924. So so we've gone from this very small group of people that could vote to pretty much every adult in the United States having the right to vote.
And what was kind of the motivation behind the expansion, and what groups were allowed in sequence to expand to? So you mentioned that with the 15th Amendment that voting was expanded to men of any race, but not yet women. Where did that come from? Okay,
so there was this idea that almost like family voting, like your family voted together. And so as the head of the household, the man would be the one that cast that vote, and that everyone in the household would be in agreement. And that was just part of the times.
Is that how your household is run, Mike?
No, not exactly. So, no, and it's, but out of the abolition movement that preceded the Civil War, you started to see the women's suffrage movement, and it just took a very, very long time from the end of the Civil War all the way till 1920 for women to get that right to vote.
And socially, I'm sure that we saw historically changes in our societal construct and the way that families are run and the role of women in society coinciding with the suffrage movement as well.
Right. So when women really went into the workforce during, not so much during World War I, but definitely during World War II, it really changed the dynamic of how the family worked, and you ended up with a 2-income household. And that kind of changed a lot of things. But I remember even talking to my own mother about the fact that she couldn't open a checking account after my mom and dad got married, or have a credit card, because those kind of things were just not given to women at that point. So there's been this long climb and this change for equity between men and women, and people of color, and all Americans.
You know, what I think is a really interesting aspect that you touched on about the rights of women as a whole kind of growing. We saw this evolution of women becoming more involved in their communities. You mentioned by picking up a full-time job, by just becoming more involved in other constructs such as the church and community events, that sort of thing. And I think that the Bible really touches on that as well when it gives us kind of this edict to really pray over our communities, to seek the welfare of our cities is literally what, Jeremiah says in the Old Testament to the exiles, that he commands them to seek the welfare of their city. And I think that as we have expanded our voting base to include those of people of color, to include women, to even include people as young as 18 who can serve in the military, we have given them this power, and it has coincided with this involvement in their city, in their communities, right?
Right. And one of the hardest things that I think that we're kind of at this point now in our history is that you have this very large group of people. You have 330 million Americans, and they're going to agree on very little.
Right.
And so the idea of coming together and coming up and finding where are places of common ground that we can move forward on. And then you have your levels of you have the city, the state, and the federal level, and understanding which each part has to move us forward in different things. I think that's definitely a conversation that people need to have and understand where each of these different government entities moves forward, and then things that maybe government shouldn't be involved in.
Right.
And that's always a conversation back and forth. And I think as we go to this issue of voting rights, like one of the things that's been a real hot button issue this year has been mail-in voting.
Right.
And when you talk about it from terms of a Christian point of view, is that yes, we want to give everyone the right to vote. We want to give everyone the opportunity to vote. And then there's also that concern on the other side of where this will lead to on both sides of it. Making sure enough people have the right to vote, and then making sure that it's not closed off to others. It's a very difficult conversation to have. And so one of the things that I've kind of seen out there lately, especially among faith groups, is to reach out and say, well, let's talk through this and see if we're going to make this conversation not really about, my feeling about this or my feeling about that, but what's going to best serve us pragmatically. Like one of the great things I've seen the state of Texas do is, hey, we're going to do curbside, voting. We're going to do early voting on October the 13th.
Right.
One of the things I've liked that I've seen is that people are reaching out and trying to make some concessions to each other. And I hope I didn't digress too far. But the point behind it is that we've got this pull and tug, and we've always had this pull and tug. And we always have to have that conversation in a very calm way, which is really hard for all of us, and to kind of move us forward to the next step. So thank you.
No, I think that you bring up an interesting issue with the mail-in voting, and we've made a commitment to not get political here. But at the same time, you do touch on kind of weighing the pros and cons on both sides, because we want to ensure that after we've had this long history of different groups of disenfranchised people fighting for that ability to go have their voice heard and be involved in the election process, that we still preserve the integrity of that process, right? And in 2020, I had a very unique experience to be involved in that and see it from a different end, because I was on both the primary ballot in March and then a runoff ballot in July. And we got to see firsthand, working polls, how things like curbside voting works and how seamless and easy and accessible that can be. We've gotten to see that with, the logistical issues and problems coming with COVID-19, that Governor Abbott has expanded early voting so that people have even more opportunities to come and have their voice heard. But we also don't want to take away from the groups of people, the thousands and millions of people who have worked so hard for the right to vote, to now throw it away and lose that integrity. There's nothing wrong with saying, okay, find a curbside voting polling location.
Right.
Find a time within this 3-week period that you can come vote. Or if you qualify for one of the special exceptions, certainly request your mail-in ballot and do what you can, have that personal responsibility to try and exercise your right to vote. We all think about Romans 13, 1-7, where Paul talks about, render unto Caesar, and that all civil authority comes to us and it's granted by God. And I think that it's really important to see our responsibility as Christians and as people of faith, not necessarily to get behind one candidate or another, or to make the church a political body adopting one, philosophy or another, but just to be informed, just to care enough about our communities, to have the information and to go cast our vote. That is a responsibility that God gives us, similar to so many other responsibilities that we have as people of faith.
Exactly, and I totally agree, because the idea of free will, that God gave us free will, the ability to make these choices for ourselves, that's a huge responsibility. And I think the right to vote definitely comes into that equation. Many times in the past, I think we have neglected overall as a society that we really have that responsibility. And like I said, I'm very excited about this election for that reason. Now, on the other side of it, one of the things you have to remember is that for every time we voted for a person, one of our friends may have voted for another person. And that their right to vote is no less important than our right to vote.
Right.
And so, those kind of conversations are very important to have, and to realize no matter who wins an election, is the idea of, I recognize that you have a right, just like I have a right. And I think that's one of the things that the church can do really, really well here, because that doesn't have any sort of religious basis at all.
Right.
I mean, not religious basis, I'm sorry, political basis. And the idea that we could still disagree while agreeing.
Well, it's love thy neighbor, right?
Love thy neighbor, yeah.
Love thy neighbor enough to go and try to make your community better by exercising your right to vote, but also love thy neighbor enough to recognize that we all have differences of opinion and that we don't need to react to each other and those differences with hate or that kind of malice that we've seen, unfortunately, so much in the last few years when it comes to the political landscape.
And it's hard because you'll see, and I think unfortunately social media has led to so many divisive issues and things that they shouldn't have really been.
Right.
So it's like one of the things you were talking about, that we have to be informed as people of faith and to understand that there's always more to a story than we're usually getting.
Right.
And so it's incumbent upon us to sit and listen to people that may disagree with us, because they're probably bringing something to the story that we may not have understood to begin with.
Now, Mike, do you have teenagers? Is that right?
I have a 16-year-old, an 11-year-old, and a 6-year-old.
And how do you approach your responsibility to be politically informed, to vote, not just if you voted in the primary a couple of months ago, then you were voting in local elections, so not even just national politics. How do you take your responsibility as a parent when you have kids that are coming up on voting age in just a few years? How has that changed your personal responsibility when it comes to election season?
It's hard because, you go out and you show them different aspects that you can say, well, these are different. You can go to the junior league puts out, a list of candidates, and they've got, all of the questionnaires and things that do. The Dallas Morning News does this as well. There's all these different places that you can get information. And then you do your own research as well, but make sure the sources are reputable. And I think it's one of the things that's really, really hard for all of us, is because it's so easy for us to get angry and to share something quickly. And so, you just have to teach kids to be like, well, you have to make decisions for yourself, and your mind will change. The person that you were at 18 is not necessarily the person you are at 38. So you have to make sure that when you make this vote, you're just using the best information you have at the time. And you may later on go, oh gosh, that was not what I thought. But that's okay, because you're dealing. You don't have hindsight. You're just dealing with the moment you have right there. And I think it's one thing that Christians need to remember, is that we don't know what the future holds. We can just do our best to make those decisions while we do it, and then once we do make those decisions, to keep the leaders accountable to what they've actually said they're going to do. And I think that's one thing that all Christians need to do, is remember to keep checking in with those political leaders, whether or not they necessarily agree with all of the policy ideas that they have, but just to make sure they understand, hey, I'm still here, and I really do think these things, and it's important, without being disrespectful.
I think that kind of touches on an interesting perspective, too, that I think there's a vast group of people, at least prior to the last few years, who really only, if they checked in for every 4 years for the presidential election,
exactly.
right? And I know even in my faith journey, I am 35 now, and when I voted as soon as I could, but I cared more about what was happening nationally. And as I have gotten older, once I had a full-time job and was out of school, I cared more about what was happening statewide. When I became a parent, I cared a lot more about what was happening locally.
With the school board,
You know, yeah, absolutely. And so I think that it is important for us, as parents and as people of faith, even within our communities and the people we have influence over, to encourage people to pay attention to elections that exist within the confines of every 4 years.
Right. And it's funny, we all take that semester of high school government. And unfortunately, we're 16, 17 years old when this happens. But there's a lot of information packed into that.
Right.
And the idea that, we have an accountability to our community, just like you were talking about from Jeremiah, that we need to be involved. It's really hard when you're a working parent and and when you've got all these other responsibilities. But we do have a responsibility to be informed with that. And we may not necessarily agree, and it may be super frustrating. I have watched more than my fair share of city council meetings. And so, I'm sorry, no disrespect to the city council. It's frustrating, but democracy is not supposed to be a quick and easy process.
Right.
It's supposed to be a slog. It's supposed to work through it. And I think it's one of the things that we all have to educate ourselves on, is that nothing worthwhile is going to work extremely quickly. It's going to be a conversation, and then another conversation. And many times in our history, it's not necessarily that one side was right or the other side was right, but that the technology changed.
Right.
And the conversation became mute to begin with. And so, and I think it's one thing that we all need to remember is that, if we go home and we look at all of the amazing things we have here in 2020. I mean, we went from sequencing or getting the digital DNA code of the coronavirus to a vaccine in 62 days. And that's unheard of. It usually takes 5 years, 5 to 10 years. We are in an amazing time in our history, and sometimes we forget that, we are moving forward at such a quick pace. And I'm so sorry. And one of the hardest things is that sometimes socially we break down so much quicker, and we have to be better than that. We have to stand up and realize that, even if someone disagrees with us, that they still have our best interest at heart.
Right.
And that piece is hard.
How do you see not even our role, because I think we've established that, but our power, our ability as Christians and as people of faith to help keep the discussion elevated in that way? Because it seems like with social media today, the only opinions that are heard are those that are the loudest and the angriest. So what do you see as our advocacy, our ability, our agency as Christians to be able to try and kind of change that narrative and come in with a Christian standpoint and yet still be heard?
I think, Theodore Roosevelt is my favorite president by far. And I think one of the things that he said that was so important, and he was actually talking about Woodrow Wilson when he actually said it, but it's true, is that when you elected an elected official, you have a body of ideas that you're trying to move forward. The things that you want to see happen in your community, your state, in your nation. How much they do related to that really looks at how much you're actually supporting what they're doing. With any political candidate, we have to remember that the office that they're holding is always going to be there for a very, very long time, whether or not the person that actually holds the office is.
Right.
So the idea that we have integrity with each of those offices, and that they are following what's best and ideal for all of the community. And when they don't choose to do that, then that's when we hold them accountable. And we don't really put so much emphasis on that person itself, but as how they are operating within that role.
Right.
So, and I know it's really hard for a lot of us, because, for example, and this is just me personally, I can't speak for anyone else. If the President of the United States walks in the room, I'm going to follow procedure. I'm going to follow protocol, regardless of whether or not I like the person in the office.
Right.
And the reason being is that it's not about the person who holds the office. It's about
the office.
It's about the office itself and what it means to us as Americans. And I think that that's one of the things that we have to continue to recognize is that we need to make the conversation about what we want as an overall society, including the people that may not agree with us. I tend to like it when people don't agree with me.
Because it gives you an opportunity to learn?
Yes, it gives me an opportunity to learn. And then also, because there's probably a point of view that I haven't looked at yet. And I think that's one, not that my point of view is the best one by any means, but the idea that we could sit down and go, okay, well, why is this person saying this? And what has happened in their life to bring them to this point? And then how can we move forward together? How is this going to work? And I think as Christians, I think that's incumbent upon us to make those decisions and say, how do we move forward together? This year marks the 150th anniversary of the 15th Amendment, giving men of color the right to vote. It also marks the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, where women won the right to vote, and the 55th anniversary of the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which submitted voting rights for all citizens over the age of 21. But it's one of the things that we should acknowledge with all of this stuff is that there's this constant dialogue that's going on in the United States. And one of the things that we need to do is continue to have that dialogue and to remember to respect one another.
Right. Yeah, to absolutely have it from a Christian paradigm, right?
Exactly.
Well, Mike, this has been an awesome opportunity to get to discuss this issue with you. I know that everyone is excited. Early voting starts here in just a few weeks. And so I appreciate you being here with us getting to do this 6 Foot Table Talk. Guys, tune in next week for a discussion on grief in the times of COVID. That 6 Foot Table Talk is going to feature Reverend Cammie Gaston and Bonnie Brophy King. With that, I'm Sarah Fox.
I'm Mike Buntyn.
And we'll see you next time.
6 Foot Table Talk, as we find out who walks the walk. It's the bane of our existence to practice social distance. 6 Foot Table Talk.